Hi everyone, so last part of this lecture, and really I want to talk in this video about some of the experiential parts of video gaming and what that experience means to us in the context of the political and social construction of video games. So really, in terms of avatars and my relationship and your relationship to the avatar we play as, what does it mean to play a video game? We control an avatar, represents us in a video game. What does this mean in terms of experience? Now, I've not actually tried to do an embedded video while I'm making a video, so hopefully this kind of works. Okay, here we got 2018, is it? Yes, September 2018, Spider-Man on the PS4. I love this game. Thought it was brilliant. I actually prefer it to Red Dead Redemption 2 so much. It's just a brilliant, brilliant game. And I'm not a big comic book fan, but I just thought the design of this was superb, and just the feeling of being Spider-Man and swinging through New York City was fantastic. And just listen to what I'm saying. Swinging through New York City. This isn't New York City. This is a representation of New York City, right? This isn't me. I am not Spider-Man. But the brilliance of the game for me was I was embodied in such a way in that character that actually, when I'm playing it, it feels like, yeah, when I'm whumping one of the guys like that, this is Spider-Man stuff. It really was remarkable the way the game was designed, it was put together, and just how cleverly you have a relationship with the character. Really, really fantastic stuff. So when I was playing Spider-Man, I kind of played that game solidly for a month. In terms of experience, what did it mean for me? Controlling that avatar, being part of that avatar's story, being able to do the things I could in it. This is an intense feeling of being immersed in that game world, to the extent to which, when I'm playing, it's like, this is New York City. It's not New York City, right? I've been to New York City. It actually is modeled really, really closely on New York City, but it isn't New York City at all. It is a computer-generated version of New York City. But that loss of feeling of my own self, an embodiment and immersion within that game environment instead, is a really, really powerful sort of situation. But what we can ask then is, okay, so you've been embodied and immersed in this world that's been created. What are the underlying politics of that world? Yeah, sorry about that. I had a bit of a technical issue then. So in terms of our relationship to the avatar, firstly, that's a really, really important point. My experience of Spider-Man on PS4, I had really, really strong identification with that avatar going on. And I guess to Red Dead Redemption 2 and other things in the past, I've felt this in the past as well with other games. So for David Gunkel, and his book Game in the System, I think, is one of the best video game texts that's been written in the past decade about the experience of video games and what that experience means in terms of its socio-political construction of games itself. Avatars are really a form of escape from the body. Gender, race, and physical characteristics are all removed from interpersonal communication, and therefore avatars allow for us to re-identify and for a re-identification of the self based on a different set of characteristics. This is a really powerful sort of sense of fantasy within the avatar-I relationship. I can be something else. I can be something else with amazing capabilities that lives in a different place, that has a different world, that it experiences, and I'm out of the mundane sort of existence that I live in, especially under lockdown, right? Crank on here, and I might even give Spider-Man a run tonight, and just spend a few hours swinging through New York. Amazing, So what is being an avatar allows me to do? Well, Novex, avatars are capable of acting in very antisocial ways. That's so disinhibiting, We see this, Red Dead Redemption 2, right? Once I finally got bored of the game and I finished it, what did I do in Red Dead Redemption 2? I rode about on my horse and killed people at random. Now, am I a psycho? Opinions, right? But, I don't do that in everyday life. Okay, I do not drive about in my car, for example, just shooting people, because it would really be frowned upon. Faults on both sides. You could probably argue away out some of them, but I'm not going to get away with it, right? Grand Theft Auto. What do we do? I mean, Grand Theft Auto 4, actually, admittedly, I never finished Grand Theft Auto 4. I kind of ground to a halt with it. I got pretty bored with it after a while, even though I recognise it's a really good game. But I got pretty bored with it at the time, and I was really busy at the time as well. But I did sort of get a penthouse and a high-powered rifle, and I would just put it on sometimes, just shoot people in the street. And that's really, really disturbing behaviour, but I'm allowed to do that kind of thing in a video game. I am not allowed to do it out of my house here in Sketty in Swansea. It's a shame because some of my neighbours are asking for it, but I can't do that sort of thing. So this antisocial disinhibitory effect, no inhibitions whatsoever to what we can do. It's really, really attractive. Now, we don't just have to behave like psychos. If you look at a game like The Sims, for example, we build worlds for our little avatars to be in, and we can quite happily be following the rules of society, actually in The Sims, in a very, very close way, because Sims rewards sort of obedient, conforming behavior in many regards as well. But there is an attraction when we are something else in this avatar to behave in ways that we're not allowed to in everyday life. And because of that, we can feel both intense attachment to that subject position we're given by the game, and a tense attachment because the shackles are let off us and we can get away with things. So others have said that avatars can act to reproduce very problematic aspects of race and gender stereotyping, and that's a very important point as well. Something that Grand Theft Auto tried to address, at least in Grand Theft Auto 5, with the inclusion of an African-American character, but that African-American character is still from the hood and is still a car thief. That's really, really problematic as well. Everyone in Grand Theft Auto is car thieves, but it was a really sort of still a stereotyping thing. So we consider the avatar to be a platonic representation of ourselves. Now you might ask what platonic is. In terms of what platonic means in this sense, I'm referring to Plato's theory of the forms, and the avatar as a representation of self then is like an ideal representation of self. What David Gunkel argues is there is what he calls an ontological difference between the real, physical, and the virtual in games that does not exist in other avatar-based media. What Gunkel is saying is that the virtual, there's a difference between me and my virtual self, obviously. And in other media that might also exist, but in video games, there's almost a purity to the difference between these things. I can, if the game allows me to, structure my virtual self to be an ideal version of myself, to have all the best characteristics or worst characteristics of me as a human being that are absolutely constrained by society. So if I am murderous, that can happen here. But Gunkel's not really talking about like excessive violence or anything here. It is more about like how one would want to live their lives outside of control of society, basically. If we didn't have to pay taxes, if we didn't have to pay rent, if we didn't have to pay utilities, what would we do with ourselves? And he says that video games gives a very, very some video games at least give us the possibility of experiencing that difference. So by acting through avatars, players take on a role distinct from, yet very much related to their own identity. And that, for us, makes our experience of video games very rich and much more experiential than the anonymity of old games where there was no such characterization, and the lack of interactivity of old media like television, etc. So we have the hottest of hot mediums. If we borrow from Marshall McLuhan's definition of what a hot and cold medium is, the video game in contemporary video games, at least, in some of the games that a lot of us have played, this is very, very hot media. We are reconstructing our own identity in many ways through the playing of games in this sense. So in terms of what does that mean in terms of behavior, despite the possibilities of antisocial behavior, any avatar's behavior is always rule-based. It's rule-based around the game. Grand Theft Auto will allow me to do things. And one of the controversies about Grand Theft Auto is that it doesn't place enough constraints around what players can do, and therefore you can engage in antisocial ways. Actually, you can read that in two ways. What Grand Theft Auto actually doesn't do really is place enough emphasis that you don't have to act in antisocial ways. You don't have to steal any cars. You know, you don't have to shoot people. The game would be fairly boring. Well, I don't know, actually. The game could be really interesting given the richness of the world that you have in Grand Theft Auto, but you don't have to do those things. It just doesn't emphasize that you could be a boring schmo in Grand Theft Auto at all. But the game is shaped in a way that the rules, if you want to progress through the game, you have to behave in antisocial ways. Basically, all behavior in video games is shaped by how the game is programmed. So we are encouraged to act in particular ways, and games have rules that form a new kind of social contract. Just like we have a social contract in society that tells me, no, Leighton, you cannot buy a penthouse in Swansea, a high-powered rifle, and just pick off pedestrians underneath you. Games have a similar kind of social contract. Now, they may not be as well defined in terms of criminality as our social contract in everyday society, but they have a social contract anywhere else. And for Gunkel, this is the basis for a critique of video games, based on the kind of social contract one must enter into the game and how this replicates the rules of everyday life. To what extent are we entering into a social contract in our game worlds, which is like everyday life? And if it isn't, what is it? And does it reproduce the codes of everyday life in different ways? Now, a lot of it has been written about rules within games. So Ian Bogost wrote a very important book about this in 2007. He revolutionized the field of video games studies by looking at the argument coded within the game rather than the ludic logic, that is, how the game is played themselves. So for Ian Bogost, the authorship of rules of behavior in games and the construction of dynamic models based on those rules are absolutely critical for us to understanding what's the point of the game, and really gives us some questions to ask about video games. You know, who writes the rules of the game? Why have they written them that way? What commercial and institutional interests are involved, and what are the politics of such rules? What Bogost and David Gunkel and others are encouraging us to do is say, okay, we inhabit this video game world. We are the avatar. Who writes the rules of our conduct, and why are they like that? And what commercial interests are involved in the production of the game? And what are the politics? What does this game tell us? So I'll go back to Grand Theft Auto again, right? What's the point of Grand Theft Auto? To steal enough money and to rip enough people off so you become respectable. I mean, really, that's the point of the Grand Theft Auto games. Is you start out as kind of a street hoodlum very often, and then you commit enough acts of wanton criminality that, you know, you can buy your way to respectability. What does this tell us about the world? You know, is this reproducing a code that we're familiar with? Yeah. That you do X, Y, and Z until you reach a position in life where society views you as okay. If you think about your own experience, what are you doing right now? You're virtually attending university because that's expected of you. And when you leave university, then you'll have a qualification which will enable you to get a particular set of jobs. Then you can, you know, have a certain amount of money. Then you can invest that money in purchasing a house. Then you can have the 2.4 children and the dog and the nice car, etc., etc. And you've made it. Respectability. Games are reproducing these kind of codes. Now, that's the classical American dream encoded that I've just said there. You know, if you work hard enough and do this, that, and the other, and you behave like a good little boy, then, you know, you'll get somewhere in life. Now, obviously, GTA is an interesting example of this because it's not asking you to behave like a good little boy or girl. It is asking you to break the rules explicitly, but to achieve the same end, to achieve a level of economic, you know, status in the world that the game finishes, and, you know, you're happy enough and you can trundle along in your fancy car and still create chaos and carnage, but, you know, you've made it at that point. So it's very much a classical sort of neoliberalist fantasy of, you know, how things will happen if you stick by the rules in everyday life. So the rules of games are always discursive and, most importantly, ideological. stumbling over such a critical word. There are there are ideologies embedded in video games themselves. And what a lot of theorists argue is that the ideologies that are embedded in contemporary video games, in the huge video games that sell massive quantities, are identical to one another. So for Newman, colonialization is a structuring principle of all video games. What does he mean? Well, colonialization, this idea that you start out with very little and you go across and conquer an environment and subjugate that environment to your will. That would be a colonialist ideology. And if you think about the video games you play, particularly console games, yes, you set out to conquer this world, to become the ruler of this world. In Grand Theft Auto, you set out to conquer the crime world of this city until you're the top dog in that city. Red Dead Redemption is a classic example of this, where you set out to do all of this sort of stuff. Even Red Dead Redemption 2, with its kind of, I'm not going to do massive spoiler alerts here, but the ending might make you think otherwise, but the guy has conquered his world. So games create separate universes with their own rules, customs, politics, economics, and inhabitants. But the colonialization ideology runs through all of these games. The purpose, even in these different universes with different rules and customs and politics and so on, is to be the boss of that world. So, virtual and synthetic worlds of digital games act as new territories, but the power relationships and ideologies communicated discursively through play and through the games and play correspond to dominant ideologies, not only dominant ideologies of elites within contemporary society. We're not just making a hegemonic argument here, but specifically the epistemological elites of digital games. So what that means is those people who make games embed their ideologies into the games themselves. The ideologies that are at play here are those who are responsible for the design and production and marketing and distribution of games themselves. So when you've got huge companies like Microsoft and Sony involved in something, it's not surprising that the ideologies at play in those games are about conquest. Commercial behavior is all about conquest and being the biggest company, right? And conquest of both others in terms of territory and in terms of wealth. Indeed, if we look specifically at who makes games themselves, we have a male, well-educated, wealthy, right-of-centre, capitalist people. And those ideologies are reproduced through digital games. So, and any divergence from that model causes significant issues such as Gamergate. So really what I'm arguing here is that video games encourage us to internalize and accept as dominant particular ideologies within society, because we are playing through them. Even something like Spider-Man. How do you complete Spider-Man? You beat up all the bad guys, you collect all the money you can, you collect all the bits and pieces that you can, you become a hero of the city of New York without problematizing at all what are the aims and objectives of the city of New York. What are you saving in New York? Well, you're saving Wall Street so that capitalism can continue. The ideologies even embedded in a game like Spider-Man can be very, very problematic if we think about them. So any divergence from this causes issues, such as, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Gamergate in a second. Now, new technologies are often heralded as ahistoric. It means they have no historical precedent, and they develop apart from cultural histories. But that's definitely not the case with video games. The rules of behavior and the goals of games are coded in line with discourses that reinforce dominant modes of conduct in society, particularly this ideology of colonialism, and that even occurs in something which seems on the surface to be quite subversive, like Grand Theft Auto 5, where you're supposed to be driving around killing people and doing this, right, and the other. Well, you're doing it to aim in order to be respectable in the eyes of a particular form of capitalism. And indeed, you're reproducing this code of colonialism constantly, where you are taking over territory, you are, dominating particular areas of the city through force in order to get places on your side, which is a classic colonialist view of the world. If we even look at something like Fortnite, largely marketed towards kids, right? You know, it's a very interesting game, Fortnite, for me, because it takes co-play from MMORPGs. There's a freemium model of mobile gaming going on there where you can purchase. You don't have to purchase anything in Fortnite, but if you want to get by, you better purchase big stuff. You're online, you're networked, it's cooperative, and in the end, one person wins. And that's classic late capitalist sort of ideology at play there. And the whole thing is desperately colonialist. You are all sort of thrown out of a plane onto an island, and you've got to dominate that island. It's colonialism in a very, very pure sense, and it's capitalistic in a massively pure sense, in that the biggest, the toughest, the strongest, the one who spends the most money and the one that realizes the most capital is the one that's going to win. You know, and of course I'm bitter and jealous because I always get my ass kicked in Fortnite all the time by kids usually as well. So in terms of, you know, if games are rule enforcing media that recycle dominant ideology through play, we must ask what ideologies are realized in behavior. So, for example, if we look at Gamergate, and you know, there's a load of material out there about Gamergate, and you can look up all that material around this lecture if you wish, but at its root, what happened in Gamergate, Zoe Quinn, a indie game designer, designs a game which receives, you know, mixed reviews, but receives some positive reviews in the video game press. An ex-boyfriend claims that one of the reviewers was one of the people who was having was somebody that Zoe was having an affair with. Blows up in terms of the sort of biases in video games journalism and video game journalism ethics. Okay, that's a discussion to be had, I guess. Not in the way that Gamergate did, because Quinn becomes a hate figure online, receiving death threats and rape threats by the 100. When women stick up for Zoe Quinn as a female video game designer, they start to receive death threats and rape threats constantly as well. You get this outpouring of misogyny and, you know, a huge pile-on, and it opens up questions about the role of women in video game development, women in the video game industry in general, and indeed even the status of women as gamers get opened up by this, and just the toxic misogyny and toxic masculinity of video gaming, or at least a part of the video game community gets exposed. Now, how do we understand this? I mean, it's a cultural moment where masculine gaming culture responds to feminist game scholars, maybe. You know, women who look to understand video games in particular ways are rebutted and told that this is something that is not for them. And you know, Gamergate is a toxic techno-culture of male dominance and misogyny carried through channels such as 4chan and Reddit. Really, we can look at Gamergate, though, as here is a group of video game designers, Quinn being one of them, but there are others, and many others, in fact, who look to video games as a method by which they can challenge patriarchal modes of communication and patriarchal discourses within society, and are shut down, you know, and are totally shut down by a wider sort of culture of video game users that have internalized the misogynistic aspect of the ideology of video games. Really, for me, Gamergate is a great example of why we need to study digital games and game culture very seriously. But obviously you can go and read a lot more about Gamergate outside of this. I just want to stop the lecture on Gamergate really, because when I'm talking about ideologies embedded in video games, the ideologies embedded in video games are actually quite dangerous. You know, colonialism, capitalism, you know, hyper-capitalism, misogyny, racism. We find these kind of, you know, ideological positions which we would often, most of us would not, you know, exhibit in everyday life, exhibited in the games that we enjoy playing. And therefore, we need to be critical when we approach video games themselves. And we need to think of it in terms of, well, we know now how big the video game industry is. Do we stand for this? You know? And we need to be critically engaged. And as we fire up our PS5s in November, maybe we want to think of these issues. Thanks, guys.